first personal income tax was imposed in 1861 to pay for the war. 3% of all incomes over US $800, but was repealed and replaced with another in 1862. Bear in mind that in 1861, $800 was several years' wages for most people. 1894, Democrats, do I need to say the usual suspects, passed the first peacetime personal income tax, 2% on incomes over $4,000, which meant that fewer than 10% of all households would pay any. 1895, in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, 157 U.S. 429 in 1895, the Supreme Court ruled the personal income tax was unconstitutional. The ruling also defined direct tax as a tax that could not be shoved off on anyone else. U.S. Constitution Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 requires that, quote, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration hereinbefore directed to be taken, end quote. Note a significant fact. Pollock was a private citizen, not a corporation or a business, and as such could not shove a tax off on anyone else. Further, the court included this definition in its ruling. Quote, direct taxes include those assessed upon property, person, business, income, etc. of those who pay them, while indirect taxes are levied upon commodities before they reach the consumer and are paid by those upon whom they ultimately fall, not as taxes but as part of the market price of the commodity. Under the second head may be classed the duties upon imports and the excise and stamp duties levied upon manufacturers. That's from Cooley, Taxation 10, which was quoted in Bouvier's Law Dictionary in 1914, pages 867 to 868. With Pollock and several other Supreme Court cases striking down a personal income tax as a violation of the prohibition against direct tax, the bankster cartels executed their intention to regain economic control over their colonies. They were 13 years late, according to their timeline. 1913. In the waning hours of the eve of Christmas break, December 23, 1913, after most of the opposition had gone home, and without a quorum, the U.S. Senate voted to pass the so-called Reserve Act, Federal Reserve Act, removing the U.S. economy from government control and turning it over to a private consortium of banks owned, once you track them down through all their financial holding companies and dummy corporations, by the same City of London banking cartels previously described. The vote was null and void for want of a quorum, and the act is unconstitutional anyway, for no power is delegated to the United States government to divest itself of its constitutional authority, in pertinent part, quote, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, end quote. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, the very progressive, read far left socialist Marxist, political research associates assert the above claim and null and void is, quote, the silliest of the Federal Reserve conspiracy theories, end quote. Because, yeah, they didn't have a quorum, but those who had left registered their approval on the record, before, after, and even if they had been there, they would have voted to pass it. Yeah, but they didn't vote to pass it. They weren't there. The Senate didn't have a quorum. The vote was illegal, and the act is null and void for lack of constitutional subject matter authority. The political research associates' claim is typical Marxist political playbook. They broke the rules, but it advances the Marxist agenda to say, move along, there's nothing to see here. The Marxist playbook must be challenged every time it is invoked. It must never be allowed to stand unchallenged. If you give a Marxist an inch, he will take a mile. Thus the Federal Reserve Act, turning our entire economy over to the same bozos we fought off in the American Revolution, was and remains today a totally unconstitutional act without lawful authority. The banksters were 13 years late regaining economic control over their colonies. They would spend the next 100 years or so consolidating their economic and political control in preparation for the next stage of their plan, which was the regaining of political control over their colonies in the year 2000. I want to reiterate, none of this means our Constitution is dissolved and is dissolved perfectly, as many corrupt politicians and their supporters have convinced themselves. It means the government created by our Constitution has abdicated its only lawful authority to govern and has become a rogue occupation government. Also in 1913, the 16th Amendment, Income Tax Amendment, and the 17th, Senators by Popular Vote Amendments, were declared ratified when they most definitely were not. The 16th Amendment purportedly permitted government to impose a capitation or direct tax upon the citizens in direct violation of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, which says, quote, "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration hereinbefore directed to be taken." Now, according to all the expressed intent of the legislators of the time, the 16th Amendment was never intended to impose a direct tax on private citizens in violation of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. It was intended exclusively to tax corporations as an excise tax on the profit the corporation derived from the employment of labor. This meant it could have been constitutional in the first place if it had been written as an excise tax instead of an income tax, since the corporation could shove it off on the employee as a condition of employment. Then we could argue about the infringement upon our right to work, but we never reached that point. No private citizen was taxed on his wages for 25 years, and when the first citizens were taxed, it was because they were government employees and therefore enjoyed the privilege of immunity for the decisions and enforcements they imposed on other citizens in the name of government. The Supreme Court has ruled that the 16th Amendment created no new tax because the government already had the authority to impose an excise tax. True, so long as the tax was imposed on the exercise of privilege by a corporation or business, and because the court claimed all the 16th Amendment did was remove the requirement of apportionment from direct taxation. Do I have to point out the award for mealy-mouthed gobbledygook represented by this ruling? If a direct tax on the people was prohibited for 126 years unless apportioned, and now it can be imposed without regard to apportionment, then it's a new tax. Guess what? The 16th Amendment was null and void anyway. It was not ratified by 3/4 of the states as required by Article 5. Several states rewrote it first and then ratified something not proposed and which no other states ratified. Kentucky even voted it down and then listed the legislation as carried in its legislative record. See The Law That Never Was, a 2-volume reference book and/or CDs available from Bill Benson's website or from the reference section of your public library, if it hasn't been confiscated by now. It contains certified copies of the legislative records of all the states the Secretary of State claimed ratified the amendment. You can prove it for yourself. The purpose of the 16th Amendment was not to support the federal government anyway. It was declared ratified when it had not been ratified because the banking cartel agents knew the gold and silver coin would be removed from our constitutional monetary system in a few years, and it would be necessary at that time to pull a percentage of worthless fiat paper money out of circulation every time it changed hands in order to mask the inflation caused by the unlimited printing of worthless paper fiat currency. What we call dollar bills today but are actually Federal Reserve notes, and they represent IOUs to the bankster cartels that own the Federal Reserve, which, by the way, is not a federal agency, and their website says so. The government borrows money from the Fed, and the Fed causes it to be created out of nothing and loaned to the U.S. government without property, and the government's future taxing power is collateral. The national debt is now several times the total value of all the collateral of the people of the United States, and the bankers have just about reached their end game. If the Marxist mafia infesting the White House and most of the U.S. Senate and almost half of the U.S. House can keep on borrowing, the United States of America will go bankrupt and the House of Cards will collapse. That is the objective of all the entitlement spending and Obamacare and anything else they can throw into the mix to put our businesses out of business and make our very survival depend on the beneficence of a bunch of Marxist apparatchiks. This was the Cloward-Piven strategy to destroy the economy of the United States. Look it up on the web, and you will find it harder and harder to believe all this stuff is just random drifting towards Armageddon, and not an orchestrated enemy-agent conspiracy designed to destroy the first nation on earth to be founded upon the principle that individual liberty trumps the arbitrary whim of kings and princes and neighborhood warlords every time. No exceptions, no excuses. The federal government has no authority outside of law, and federal law has no authority outside the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution makes a clear and consistent distinction between the people and the states. They are not the same political entity. The people created the states, and the people in the states, with the concurrence of the people, created the federal government. The House of Representatives represents the interests of the people in the federal legislature, and the U.S. Senate represents the interests of the states, or it's supposed to. At the same time, the Illegal Federal Reserve Act became color of law, and the 16th Amendment, the Income Tax Amendment, was proposed. The 17th Amendment was proposed. The purpose of the 17th Amendment was to remove the choosing of U.S. senators from the states as a separate entity from the people and authorize their election by popular vote, the same as for members of the House of Representatives.